Yaroslav Romanchuk, president of the International Institute for Freedom, economist and popularizer of the Austrian School of Economics in the post-Soviet space, is joining us now. Yaroslav, we are glad to welcome you.
Good morning, good afternoon.
Yaroslav, here is some fresh news. A publication by Izvestia, Russian Izvestia, where they talk to entrepreneurs, members of the Delovaya Rossiya Council, in short, people who, let's be honest, really understand the Russian economy. So in this year, they predicted the closure in Russia of hundreds of thousands of cafes, bakeries, footwear manufacturers, freight carriers, and so on and so forth. In short, small businesses. What challenges should Russians be prepared for this year? And in particular, representatives of small and medium-sized businesses. And in general, is it even possible to prepare for this? And in fact, such grim forecasts could come true in Russia. Can you imagine
how happy the Ministry of Defense and all those involved in mobilization are about this news? Because for them, hundreds of thousands of mouths and hands, potential cannon fodder, will be ready. People without jobs, especially in the regions, where will they go? They will be tempted by the millions of rubles they can get from mobilization. So, this is the case in a normal country that is focused on development and increasing incomes. On well-being, in other words, the goals that we accept and know Europe, America, all our partners in NATO countries, the Group of Seven. But in Russia, the Kremlin's objective has always been and remains unchanged. Now, in the fifth year of the large-scale war, it still remains so. The elimination, the destruction of Ukraine, of Ukrainian identity, of Ukrainians. Therefore, in order to achieve this, they need to use all sorts of cynical, cruel, inhumane measures, including the destruction of the economy. Before the war, in 2021, there were about 20 to 22 million people in Russia. They were living below or at the poverty line. Today, there are even more, and there will be even more. But for the rulers, for whom losing or burying 1.5 to 2 million people means nothing, because their objectives are completely different, genocidal, it costs them nothing. So, when we talk about, say, the growth rate of the Russian economy in 2025 being only 1%, and their goods exports in 2025 amounting to just under $420 billion compared to 430 to 435 billion last year, yes, that's less. Yes, the economy is slowing down. Yes, there will be bankruptcies. And when Gref or other businessmen from the Russian Union of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs, when they speak out, when they issue warnings, what are they really fighting for? They're fighting to get a bigger share for themselves, to have their loan costs reduced, to have their debts written off. And what about everything else? Meanwhile, millions of small businesses will be buried, and they couldn't care less about that. Because this is essentially the feeding ground for the Ministry of Defense and for those who continue to wage a genocidal war. So yes, Russia has come closer to a crisis, but again, its economy, which according to the World Bank and IMF estimates exceeds $2.5 trillion. Let me remind you, in 2021 it was 1.7 trillion. Naturally, it will find $200 billion to continue the war.
Due to these, you could say, global problems with selling Russian energy resources around the world, small Russian oil companies have started to collapse. How much of a safety margin do the large companies have?
Large companies, it's not like business is separate and the state is separate. In a Nazi, fascist state led by Putin, who is also at the head of the mafia, the energy barons, and everyone else, it's all just moving money from one pocket to another. If private companies run out of money, they'll be nationalized. State-owned companies will be pumped full of credit resources. If there's inflation, they'll take away tens of billions of dollars. They'll take it from the population. They'll take it from the pockets and the purchasing power of the people. That's why what happened in 2025, we saw it. Lukoil took a hit, and other private companies took a hit as well. Even if they leave the market, I think the determination of Putin's Nazi regime to wage and continue the war won't diminish, because he responds only to military force. On the West's determination, together with Ukraine, to fight until victory, until the capitulation of this very regime. If we and our partners have still been hesitant to say this publicly in 2025, it naturally only strengthens Putin himself. The fact that we are adopting the 20th package of sanctions, we, meaning the European Union, and still haven't adopted it, that our respected partners, senators, congressmen, are saying, well, maybe a sanctions law, maybe a new lend-lease. Well then, go ahead and adopt it, friends. How much longer can we endure this? How much longer can we drag it out? And this drawn-out process, this lack of understanding of the nature of the war, primarily by the American leadership and many in Europe, leads to the situation where, yes, for the fifth year we have been demonstrating unprecedented bravery and courage, and we are the leader of the free world, but we undoubtedly need military and financial support, and moral and psychological support from the entire world.
In your opinion, do you think Europeans will have enough resolve to act more decisively, at least when it comes to selling their energy resources to Russia, at least within Europe, the Baltics, the North Sea, to somehow influence the shadow fleet? After all, the example set by the United States was quite striking, and could this happen? Could it continue, but now at the hands of the Europeans?
Let's look at what share of the so-called shadow fleet was actually stopped by the American authorities or forces. Well, 1%, 2% at most. So we understand that with measures like these, naturally, nothing significant can be achieved. Turning the Baltic Sea into a zone completely controlled by NATO countries would be an excellent solution. Therefore, naturally, what I hear from Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany, and from Meloni, who has become more decisive, as well as from Britain, their position is good. Poland, Donald Tusk speaks excellently, saying that we are fighting, Ukraine is fighting not only for itself, but also for the West. Because if something happens, a major bloody war will come to Europe. Undoubtedly, the President of Finland, the Scandinavian and Baltic countries are reliable partners, and also Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, these are our partners. Therefore, the formation of such a coalition, not only of those who are willing, but of those who are taking action, is a very important point. Undoubtedly, it is necessary to prohibit Russia from using the Baltic Sea for any trade transactions at all. We need to consider the position of imposing a trade embargo on petroleum products in our region. Naturally, what Donald Trump promised was not only to introduce, but also to enforce and monitor the implementation of sanctions. For those countries that buy Russian petroleum products and energy resources, China in particular and India, this would be very beneficial. But again, it is necessary to revive and restore the transatlantic partnership. And the proposal that President Zelensky voiced in Davos and at the Munich conference, the unified European security system, in my view, is the foundation for future cooperation and ultimately for victory over Nazi Russia.
India's firm decision to refuse to buy Russian oil has consequently resulted in China buying it at incredibly low, rock-bottom prices, with the most substantial discounts currently available on the market. How likely is it that this whole situation could continue with tankers waiting for buyers at sea? How long can this go on? And how low can these discounts for China go? Well, I don't know. It could get to the point where Russia sells this oil at a loss to itself since, so to speak, it's no longer in demand.
Remember, in the 2010s, oil prices even went negative, so they were even paying extra to the countries that bought the oil, right? I think we're close to that scenario now, where Russia will undoubtedly be selling at a loss. Remember, at the end of the 90s, the 1990s, the price was around $10 to $12, and they were still trading. So, when you extract some resource from the earth, you even pay extra for it, and then you get some foreign currency revenue. With that foreign currency revenue, you buy spare parts and components for weapons, and then with those weapons, the fighting just continues again. This is Russia's logic, the logic of a terminator, a genocidal killer, not that of a government entity striving for development and raising social standards. So, they will sell everything. They'll even sell Baikal to the Chinese just to have the means to keep fighting. That's the nature of this regime. So yes, we need to negotiate, we need to impose sanctions, we need to set limits. But in a situation where even 40% of the world economy is gray, meaning, there are ways to pay with cryptocurrency, there are ways to conduct transactions in cash and through small banks that do not operate on the international market. So, unfortunately, these mechanisms will not lead to a quick end or a rapid collapse of the Russian regime. It's necessary. Once again, the military component is needed, without which victory over the Russian Nazi Federation is impossible.
Well, many people say that China benefits from a Russia that is at war, weak economically and independent from China. But Russia definitely won't become strong economically. After the war ends, how can we make China understand that Russia will essentially remain a Chinese vassal even after a peace agreement is signed?
I hope that after our victory, the entity known as the Russian Federation in its current form will cease to exist forever. I think that's what's ahead of us. This is the final stage of the collapse of the Russian Empire, the Soviet totalitarian empire. This was the West's gravest mistake. It was that in the 1990s, they didn't go further and didn't insist that the Russian Federation disintegrate so that dozens of independent states would be formed. And this final stage, I think, will be the nail in the coffin. Ukraine, the Ukrainian people, Ukrainian resistance, which will convince the West, Europe, and America, in the end, to eliminate this empire of evil. China, of course, sees what is happening, you know. Just recently at the Munich conference, a report was published about the risk map of BRICS countries and G7 countries. And what do you think out of the 32 risks that were on the list, ranging from extreme weather conditions, climate change, things that never happen? For the Chinese, the risk from Russia is in 32nd place, the very last one. This is disregard. It's kind of, the Chinese don't see any risk in Russia at all. Therefore, naturally, it is in their interest for this colossus on long legs to fall. And they lay claim to a certain part of Russian territory, which they could easily occupy without a shot, without anything. I think that up to Siberia with Lake Baikal, including it, will become Chinese territory. Well, as for the rest, naturally, it will be necessary to assume the formation of other states, countries. So we are witnessing the decline of this absurd, cruel, inhumane anti-civilization, which we are fighting against and which we will defeat.
Thank you for staying in touch with us. Joining us in the Freedom Studio was Yaroslav Romanchuk, president of the International Institute for Freedom, economist, and a popularizer of the Austrian School of Economics in the post-Soviet space.